Super Neptunia RPG is the latest spin-off in Compile Heart and Idea Factory's ongoing Neptunia series. In a way, it's a loose reimagining of some of the themes and plot elements of an earlier Neptunia game, but it will not require you to have any experience with the series prior to jumping in at this one. It's worth noting here as well that this game wasn't directly developed by the usual teams and was instead outsourced to a studio called Artisan Studios, first founded in Paris, France, and now based in Quebec, Canada. As such, the usual trappings of Compile Heart's typical gameplay mechanics won't be as pronounced here, but that's not to say that it won't have trappings of its own. For a channel such as mine, it's probably stuck out to a few of you that I've never covered any Neptunia games before. Hey. Hey. Okay, be good. For a channel such as mine, it's probably stuck out to a few of you that I've never covered any Neptunia games before. And for what it's worth, it's really just that I never had an excuse to outside of my video on the worst games in my collection, according to Metacritic. In which case, the very next game that would have been on that list was the original Neptunia, and I really didn't want to go down that road that day. That's actually why I stopped the video where I did. This time around, I seen this game on a pretty good sale at an EB Games. I was aware that it had Canadian development roots, and I was kind of looking forward to covering a game that was made on my home turf. So, that's what we're going to do today, and we're going to jump in first by looking at the story.
She got away again! You're back! No luck, huh?
The story begins with our titular main character, Neptunia Neptune Neppington, and yeah, I made some of that name up, but it has a good ring to it. Neptune awakes in a 2D game world and finds herself in classic Iffy Heart fashion, stricken with amnesia. Not the first time for her, and it probably won't be the last. Of course, Neptune does not belong in a 2D video game world, and so our isekai fish out of water story begins as she struggles to navigate the world and its various quirks, such as the 2D game world taxes, which of course she quickly gets tangled up in. Looking to find clues to her identity and any way back to the world she came from, Neptune comes across many types of people, not all very well intentioned. In her travels, she also comes across a tome, which lights up every time she finds herself in close proximity to an ally. These allies, of course, are also stricken by the Iffy Heart condition known as amnesia. On a base level, this is all we really have to work with for the story, but then Neptunia games have never really been that deep. Throughout the world, we do find a lot of forces at work, moving against one another in some rather interesting ways, and they actually do quite a bit to make the world feel rather full and a little bit alive. There are many unique forces of good and evil, and that curious space in between. Thankfully, the world isn't entirely out to get Neptune, but it can take some time to fully discern who is on your side and who is not. It's not a large world by any stretch of the imagination, but it does have its fair share of memorable and likable characters, and even some fun and self-aware dialogue from the NPCs. This shows itself pretty early on in quite a meta way, when one NPC in particular goes off on a tangent about how game studios are always developing the same game over and over, which is largely what's going on here, but at least they're honest about it. If you're into Neptunia, chances are you're not into it for the story, but more so for the genre parody and lovable cast. And despite development changing hands, the new writers seem to have a great understanding of the series' prominent strengths and carried them on wonderfully. By the end of the game, it's also not really that much of a detriment that the story doesn't have a much deeper plot, as it is incredibly short for an RPG, only clocking in at around 17 to 18 hours long. That said, in the closing 4 or so hours, things really ramp up, but the execution and ramping them up leaves a little bit to be desired, where the plot kind of just gets dumped in a couple 1 hour long visual novel segments. Prior to this, there wasn't much visual novel stuff at all, and as such, it kind of comes off feeling like it was just sprung on the player and really disruptive to the flow of the game. But it does help the end have meaning and the journey come to a reasonable close, so it's hard to criticize it much beyond that. Since we've basically exhausted the story without spoiling the very few developments and the character alignments, let's take a look at what Super Neptunia RPG offers for a battle system and how it tries to keep exploration interesting. Because this is the area where this game stands apart most from the other series entries. We'll start with the exploration.
Like the wind! Zoom! Jump!
As you've likely noticed, this game is entirely 2D, so this of course means you'll only be moving left to right, but there are certain paths that you can navigate that lead you more into the background or foreground on diagonals. However, it is quite cumbersome to navigate to these paths where only a small window of space is given for their entry, and it's rather difficult to tell exactly where that window opens and where it closes. In a way, general navigation feels stringent, like moving in the overworld in a game like Donkey Kong Country 3 or an older 2D point-and-click adventure game. It's not telegraphed well at all what is and isn't accessible or what works as a platform. The dungeons and field maps are populated with platforming sections, and this is one area that I actually wish they borrowed more from Donkey Kong Country. I don't think there's anybody who will claim that the platforming here is any good. Platform sizes just don't feel right compared to the character, and the jump arc and speed is very tough to control and land well. Control of your character while airborne feels incredibly touchy, and the camera's response to your movements always feels disorienting. To aid in most jumps, you do get a double jump and even a little companion flan, or rather a conflanion, if you will, who you can use as a springboard to reach greater heights. Unfortunately, none of this helps tackle the longer jumps, which are often just straight leaps of faith. To get greater distance in a jump, we also have a dash mechanic, which gives you a short horizontal burst, but it's all covered in a sickening amount of motion blur. Strangely, the dash mechanic is turned off in towns, which I don't understand at all, considering the towns are also laid out so that platforming is needed to reach certain destinations. Though the platforming technically adds variety and challenge to exploration, I'd probably take boredom and no variety over the aggravation and annoyances it causes. When in dungeons, outside of platforming and of course battles, the only other major thing you'll be doing is side questing. Most side quests are picked up by talking to NPCs, but none of them really amount to anything more than generic fetch quests or hunts. At least aside from one that works more like a collectathon quest, which is really just a really long fetch quest. This quest in particular, you start at the very beginning of the game, but it is just a quest to collect as many magic stones as possible. The stones are a decent enough little side quest on paper, but in execution, they're all a bit of a joke. Basically, anytime you come across one of these little doohickeys in a dungeon, you give it a whack with your sword and a bunch of small stones will appear throughout the dungeon, and a timer will begin to count down. Sometimes all the stones are right there in front of you, and it takes no effort at all to collect. Other times you need to run the entire length of the dungeon to find them all. Unfortunately, a lot of these involve the underbaked platforming mechanics, and if they span several rooms, you need to make sure that you don't get into a battle along the way, or the challenge will cancel out, and you'll need to backtrack to start it all over again. I had an interest in collecting these at first, but that was an interest that waned the further in I got. If any of them started to seem annoying, I gradually just gave into abandoning them. They just weren't doing much to improve my playthrough, and actually turned into a huge hindrance before the end. Now, on the dungeon layouts, where it is all just left and right, then exiting through foreground and background doors to enter the next left and right screen, most areas in dungeons look quite similar to each other, and as a result can become rather disorienting. It's hard to get a logical picture of how these zones and screens are connected to each other, and despite the maps, it just doesn't feel like it makes the most sense. There's enough variety in how dungeons look between each other to fill the runtime of the game, but no dungeon design will really grab and hold your attention. At this point, you've probably also noticed these enemy mobs roaming the dungeon in real time. So let's talk about what happens when you interact with them now. Let's talk about the battle mechanics.
I got a crit! I choose you!
You can start battle simply by walking into an enemy, or if you want to start with an advantage, you can strike at your foe before battle begins, allowing you to begin the battle with 2 AP, which we'll discuss shortly. You bring up to 4 units into battle with you at a time, and each unit is placed in one of 4 locations corresponding to a face button. While combat is technically turn-based, the whole thing still unfolds in real time. In order to attack, you must first have AP to trade for the attack. AP charges up gradually over time, but can be gained in a number of ways. I mentioned one already. A preemptive strike before battle starts will start you off with 2 AP, allowing you to begin your assault as soon as battle begins. If you attack an enemy with its weakness, this will also add to your AP. The entire party shares the AP pool, and so strategy mainly revolves around finding the right character and skill to attack with primarily. Your primary character then spams attacks the enemy is weak to charge the AP meter so everybody can attack. On the note of skills, Each character can have 4 skills equipped at a time, but using your skills is a bit of an exercise in memory retention, an exercise brought about by a strange and unintuitive control scheme. The D-pad in battle is used to cycle through enemy targets, and the face buttons attack with the character who's placed in a corresponding formation position. A character's attack is dependent on where in the formation they stand, so to access other skills you have to rotate your party formation using the left and right shoulder buttons. To give an example of how this works, Neptune might have a standard attack on the left side of the formation. However, at the bottom of the formation she may have a fire-based attack. When she's on the left side of the formation, you would use the leftmost face button to attack with her. When she's on the bottom of the formation, you would use the southmost face button to attack with her. Face buttons correspond to formation positions rather than characters, so choosing your attacks comes down to putting characters in the right positions. You should also hope that you have a good memory, as they will not tell you who has what skills in what position while you're in battle. Though this all works a bit like a classic RPG I'm rather fond of, Valkyrie Profile. Actually, a lot of this game kind of borrows from that and just makes it worse. I find it's all rather cumbersome, and to be honest, I'd rather not deal with a memorization game or formation swapping at all. What I would prefer is that we use L and R to cycle through enemies. Then, to attack, we hold down a directional button that corresponds to your character. This would then create a drop-down menu displaying what 4 skills that character has. Then you would hit a face button that corresponds to the skill you want to use. Maybe the face buttons, when pressed on their own without holding down a direction button, will just launch a character's standard attack. Then we would have no need for the memorization game or the formation swapping. The whole thing has a good base idea, but something just always feels off about it. The only other somewhat unique thing about the battle here is this meter here, the break gauge. As you deal damage to the enemy, this meter charges up and can be charged up in 4 different increments. When you activate this, you can launch a character's most powerful attack. If you charge all 4 increments, then you can launch all 4 large attacks consecutively. I only got to stage 4 once though. The game was generally too easy to ever get it that high, and most battles are over too quick for how slow this thing is to charge. Otherwise, the standard RPG commands like items and run remain intact, but aside from that, there's not really much else to the battle. There is an armor, accessory, and weapon screen that shouldn't be ignored, as your gear turns the tide of battle more than anything else. Gear comes with unique skills and abilities that a player can learn through prolonged use. Skills are active when gear is equipped, but if you wear the gear long enough, you can learn the skill permanently. Then you would use your skill points to keep that skill active even when the armor or weapon you learned the skill from is long gone. And that's really about it. Looking at the Neptunia series in a vacuum, as far as Neptunia games go,
it's pretty good!
And I know that compared to other Neptunia games is a bit of a low bar here, but it's probably the most important one. It's mostly Neptunia fans who will be looking into this game anyway, so if you already like the series, you probably won't be too disappointed in this one. For everybody else and not looking at this in a vacuum, it's still pretty subpar, as the Neptunia games generally are. But now comes the scary part of the video. Now comes the part where I tell you I played this game on Nintendo Switch, and it sucks. So with that little bit of forward, let's jump into the technical aspects of Super Dimension Neptunia. Let's jump into the technical aspects of Super Neptunia RPG, as well as some of its other design flaws.
How's this? Yeah, you can't beat a protagonist. Did my literature star all the time? I haven't even reached my limit.
Remember our orders. No one can enter. Got that? Keep an eye out. Got it.
We'll start by looking at the controls again. On the design flaw side of things, for being an entirely 2D game, it is a massive thing to overlook the D-pad support. The D-pad is not used for anything during exploration, and I vastly prefer D-pads for side-scrollers. Joysticks simply don't feel right. To make matters worse, many of the controls here feel really unresponsive and sometimes delayed, which makes the platforming feel 10 times worse. Input delay is very evident when trying to use menus. Scrolling left and right has about a 40% chance chance of doing what you want, and a 30% chance of double tapping, and another 30% chance of not doing anything at all. It gets frustrating very quickly. Where it's evident even further is in combat, where the game's frame rate and stability completely tanks. Cycling through party formations suffers the same issues as scrolling through menus, where you might double tap or not tap at all. This becomes incredibly disorienting, not only because of the horrid frame rate, but also because of the sickening amount of motion blur put on all of the characters in rapid motion. It's incredibly hard to read what's going on. This motion blur confuses me a great deal too. I feel like the motion blur was just meant to hide some of the cheap and janky animation, but it also feels like this blur effect directly causes slowdown, where slowdown always accompanies it. That said, slowdown is present almost more often than it's not. Beyond the slowdown and motion blur making combat unfun and hardly readable, glitches during battle are always abound. On multiple occasions I've had characters die in combat, but their corpse remains standing and animated. On a couple special occasions, all my characters had their skills randomly erased and replaced with just regular attacks. After completing fights like this, I'd have to go into the party menus and re-equip all of the skills. Every 10 to 20 minutes, the game serves up a new glitch or a new problem, and every time I thought I saw it all, something else would occur. One time while trying to move from one screen to another in a dungeon, the screen just went black. I thought I was stuck in a long load, but then I held a direction button and just walked myself back to the previous screen and tried again. Another time, I walked to another screen, and rather than, going to the next screen, I spawned in the middle of the room I was trying to leave. Another time, when I did actually manage to properly walk into the next screen, the camera was broken there, and I wasn't able to scroll right, so I couldn't progress. In this specific location here, going in and out of this building constantly breaks things. The camera behaves erratically and inconsistently, and it seems I have about a 50% chance of triggering a falling animation for seemingly no reason at all. Even without these glitches, location designs have annoying flaws. Some areas are straight 2D images with no layers or parallax scrolling, so jumping in places like this actually causes me to fall ahead of the foreground. Where there are foreground images, you'll find many are placed in annoying locations, making it so that when you enter a new screen, your character's completely hidden. NPC text boxes sometimes come with their own flaws. Sometimes you'll get a dialogue prompt, but no window will load. Some boxes collide with UI elements, and other times they just don't position well, so half of what you're trying to read is off screen. There's other shortcomings that you can argue are maybe a design choice, but feel like a lack of quality of life to me. Like when purchasing new armor or weapons, you can't compare it to what you already have, so the whole thing just kind of becomes a chore if you want to purchase with sense. Now, we could go on all day covering every little glitch, hiccup, delayed input, and frame drop I experienced in this short little RPG, but I think you guys get the point. The delayed inputs and stability alone make this absolutely a putrid excuse of a port. The glitches are just the icing on the cake. But that said, buggy as it is, it's not completely broken. The game is beatable, and for some of you out there that may be enough, but I highly recommend looking into the game on PC if you're curious. At least there, the content is fully intact, unlike on PlayStation 4 where 2 event CGs have been censored, and there the performance is way better than it is on Switch. Otherwise, some more general aspects of the game are okay. The game supports dual audio, English and Japanese. I left the game in English as I liked how the English voice acting for the anime turned out, and I hoped it would be of similar quality. And while the quality is certainly serviceable, the characters' cries and quotes while jumping and dashing get annoying and repetitive quick.
Like a kangaroo! Boing! 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 Like a kangaroo!
After a couple hours of listening to that, I switched to Japanese and found it wasn't really any better. If anything, I'd say it was worse, as the lines there are just as annoying to hear, but also not subtitled, so I switched back. The music is a big bag of meh. Standard, cheap, tropey. At least not counting the intro tune, which is pretty nice and serene, but I would probably get copy claimed for playing that, so I won't. The sound effects are stock and the art, well, I actually don't mind the art style in general. Sure, some animation is cheap and design layout is poor, but the style isn't half bad, and I think the character designs lend very well to this art form. The story CGs obviously stand out the most, but even the character models and world detail look okay. But that's where I'm gonna leave it today. As far as Neptunia games go, this one is a cut above the average for them. At least it is for me. I guess it all depends on what you're looking for out of these games. But as far as released versions of this game go, as one of my followers on Twitter put it, it runs like boiled dog shit. Which in retrospect might actually mean that it runs well. I'm not sure, I've never boiled dog shit, but I do get his sentiment. Other folks on Twitter informed me that they hadn't had these frame rate issues on PS4 or PC, so if you're going in, do better than I done. Heed the reviews and check it out on a different platform. And just to jump back to one thing that I touched at the very start of this video, I've seen a lot of people use this to further their agenda of using Compile Heart and Idea Factory as a punching bag. And while I get it, as I've been no stranger to criticizing some of their games in the past, much to the chagrin of a vocal minority, credit and criticism needs to be handed out where it's due. They did oversee some of this game as producers, but this was not their development, and they shouldn't be held entirely accountable. And that's it for today, folks. Man, I really wanted this to be better, but Canada, my guys, you kind of let me down this time. Anyway, folks, if you guys liked the video or found it useful at all, you know the deal. Like, comment, subscribe, and share the video if you can. Links to all of my socials are in the description below, and as always, guys, thanks for watching. And for what it's worth, it's really just that I never had an excuse to outside of my video on the worst games in my collection, according to Metacritic. Hey! In which case, the very next game that would have been on that list was the original Neptunia, and I really didn't want to go down that road that day. It sucks. Whatever that's going to be used for. It's pretty good!